welcome to G-Fun Facts Online. The late Cretaceous landscape of North America was not a quiet place. In the dense, humid floodplains of what is now the Hell Creek Formation, a creature the size of a pigeon pecked its way out of an elongated egg. Covered in a coat of downy proto-feathers, with enormous eyes, a slender snout, and gangly legs, this hatchling looked absolutely nothing like the apocalyptic apex predators that have dominated human pop culture for over a century. Yet, this fragile creature was a Tyrannosaurus rex. If it managed to survive the harrowing first years of its life, it would undergo one of the most extreme, terrifying, and biologically magnificent transformations in the history of vertebrate evolution, eventually swelling into a 40-foot-long, 18,000-pound engine of bone-crushing destruction. But how exactly does a creature morph from a long-legged, feathered runner into a multi-ton behemoth capable of snapping the femurs of a triceratops? For decades, paleontologists could only guess. They lined up fossils of different sizes and attempted to connect the dots based solely on external shapes. Today, the science of paleontology has evolved from a simple study of rocks into a deep, complex biological science. By looking inside the fossils, literally slicing open the bones of the world's most famous predators, scientists have decoded the life cycles, growth rates, and lifespans of the tyrannosaurids. This study of an organism's development from embryo to adult is known as ontogeny. In the case of the Tyrannosauridae family, which includes Tyrannosaurus, Tarbosaurus, Albertosaurus, Gorgosaurus, and Daspletosaurus, ontogeny is the master key to understanding not only the animals themselves, but the entire ecological balance of the late Cretaceous world. To understand the lifespan of a dinosaur, one must first understand how to read a bone. Dinosaurs, much like modern reptiles and amphibians, experienced seasonal fluctuations in their growth. During times of plenty, which were the warm, resource-rich wet seasons, they grew rapidly. During this time, their bodies laid down highly vascularized, spongy bone tissue. However, during the lean times of drought or harsh winters, their metabolism slowed down and bone growth effectively stalled. This cyclical halt in growth leaves a permanent microscopic scar in the microstructure of the bone, known as a line of arrested growth, or a lag. Much like the rings of an ancient redwood tree, these lags can be counted to determine the exact age of the animal at the time of its death. The scientific discipline dedicated to this microscopic study of fossil bone tissue is called paleohistology. To age a tyrannosaurid, paleontologists typically use the weight-bearing bones of the legs, such as the femur, which is the thigh bone, or the fibula, the calf bone, because these bones record the most consistent growth over the animal's life. A researcher will use a diamond-tipped saw to extract a small core or cut a cross-section from the midshaft of the fossilized bone. The slice is then ground down until it is so incredibly thin that light can pass right through it. When placed under a polarizing microscope, a spectacular hidden landscape of osteons, blood vessel canals, and stark dark lines of arrested growth is revealed. However, decoding the Tyrannosaurid bone clock is not as simple as just counting tree rings. As a Tyrannosaurid grew, its bones did not simply add layers to the outside. Instead, they constantly remodeled from the inside. The medullary cavity, which is the hollow center of the bone that housed the marrow, expanded as the animal grew, absorbing and erasing the innermost, earliest growth rings. To determine the true age of a massive adult T-Rex, paleontologists must back-calculate the missing early years by superimposing the lag spacing from known juvenile specimens onto the adult's remaining outer rings. Through this intricate histological detective work, scientists have pieced together the Tyrannosaurid survivorship curve. It paints a picture of a species that lived life in the fast lane. They experienced a childhood of extreme vulnerability, a teenage phase of explosive, terrifying growth, and a brutal adulthood that almost inevitably led to an early death. Let us start with those vulnerable early years. The fossil record is notoriously biased against small, delicate things. Because of this, infant tyrannosaurids were long considered the ghosts of the Cretaceous period. Their fragile, highly pneumatic bones were easily crushed by heavy sediment, dissolved by acidic soils, or completely digested by scavengers long before they ever had the chance to fossilize. However, recent discoveries have finally brought these infants into the light. Microfossil sites in Alberta and Montana have yielded tiny tyrannosaurid teeth, no larger than a grain of rice. alongside fragmentary embryonic jawbones and claws. These rare remains tell us that a hatchling tyrannosaurid was roughly 3 feet long from snout to tail and weighed just a few pounds. In their very first year of life, infant tyrannosaurs faced a true crucible of survival. They were on the menu for everything larger than themselves, including dromaeosaurs like raptors, large crocodilians, massive azhdarchid pterosaurs attacking from the sky, and even other, older tyrannosaurs. Their primary defense in this terrifying world was pure speed. The ontogenetic scaling of tyrannosaurids shows that juveniles had exceptionally long lower legs, specifically the tibia and metatarsals, compared to their upper legs, the femur. This is the absolute hallmark of a highly cursorial, or running, animal. An infant tyrannosaurid did not hunt anything like its parents. It lacked the deep, heavy skull and thick, bone-crushing teeth that perfectly characterized the adults. Instead, its snout was long and low, and its teeth were slender and blade-like. These jaws were engineered perfectly for slicing through the flesh of small lizards, mammals, and juvenile dinosaurs. This stark difference in diet and hunting style introduces one of the most vital concepts in dinosaur ecology, which is known as ontogenetic niche partitioning. In modern ecosystems, apex predators like lions and wolves share their habitat with mid-sized predators like leopards, hyenas, and coyotes. But in the late Cretaceous ecosystems, dominated by tyrannosaurids, a strange and fascinating phenomenon occurs in the fossil record. There is a glaring absence of medium-sized carnivores. Aside from the massive, multi-ton tyrannosaurids and the small, raptor-like theropods, the entire middle management of the food web seems to be completely missing. Paleontologists hypothesize that tyrannosaurids monopolized the ecosystem by occupying completely different ecological niches as they grew and aged. A single species effectively acted as several different species over the course of its lifespan. When a tyrannosaurid reached its teenage years, it entered an exponential growth phase that defies any modern comparison. Histological data extracted from Tyrannosaurus rex reveals that around age 14, the animal's metabolism kicked into absolute overdrive. For a period of about 4 to 5 years, a teenage T-Rex was packing on up to 4.6 pounds, or over 2 kilograms, of body mass every single day. During this incredible adolescent phase, the animal was a living nightmare for the local fauna. A 15-year-old Tyrannosaurid was roughly the size of a modern rhinoceros, but it was built like an oversized greyhound. It was too fast for heavily armored prey like Ankylosaurus, but it was perfectly adapted to run down swift, medium-sized herbivores like ornithomimids and young hadrosaurs. Its jaws were actively transitioning during this time. The skull began to deepen, and the muscles anchoring the jaw expanded, but it was still a pursuit predator that relied on slicing flesh rather than pulverizing bone. By acting as the mid-sized predators of their environment, teenage tyrannosaurids actively outcompeted and suppressed the evolution of other medium-sized theropod species. They were the undisputed masters of the mesopredator niche, creating an ecosystem entirely ruled by a single family of theropods. But the story of the teenage tyrannosaur has a massive twist. For decades, the narrative of this teenage phase was defined by a handful of incredibly well-preserved, slender tyrannosaur skulls and skeletons recovered from the Hell Creek Formation. The most famous of these was a beautifully intact specimen nicknamed Jane, housed at the Burpee Museum of Natural History, along with a skull discovered in 1942 by the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. These specimens were highly cursorial. They possessed long, low snouts, blade-like teeth, and exceptionally long legs. Back in 1988, researchers analyzed the Cleveland skull and declared it to be a completely new, smaller species of tyrannosaur, naming it Nanotyrannus lancensis, which translates to the tiny tyrant. However, as the concept of dramatic Tyrannosaurid ontogeny gained massive traction in the early 2000s, the scientific consensus shifted drastically. For nearly 20 years, the prevailing wisdom in paleontology dictated that Nanotyrannus was not a real species at all. Rather, researchers believed that Jane and the Cleveland skull were simply teenage Tyrannosaurus rex specimens, undergoing their awkward, slender adolescent phase before expanding into bulky adults. This consensus firmly formed the bedrock of T-Rex ontogeny for a whole generation of scientists. But science is a dynamic, ever-correcting process. In late 2025, one of the fiercest and longest-running debates in paleontology was finally blown wide open. In a pair of absolute bombshell papers published in the prestigious journals Nature and Science in late 2025, researchers applied cutting-edge paleohistology and rigorous morphological analysis to finally settle the Nanotyrannus question once and for all. The astonishing results forced a massive rewrite of Tyrannosaurid ontogeny. A team led by Dr. Christopher Griffin and Dr. Caitlin Collery at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History extracted histological data from the 80-year-old Cleveland skull holotype. Because they lacked limb bones for this specimen, they used an innovative histological approach on a small, previously overlooked bone to determine the animal's exact age. The results under the microscope were undeniable. The bone tissue clearly showed the tightly packed outer growth rings of an animal that had completely ceased growing. The Cleveland skull did not belong to a rapidly growing teenager as previously thought. It belonged to a mature, fully grown adult. Simultaneously, a massive collaborative study published in Nature by Dr. Lindsay Zano and Dr. Nick Longrich analyzed over 200 tyrannosaur fossils. They compared the disputed teenage specimens against actual, verified known T-Rex juveniles. They found stark anatomical differences that simply could not be explained by growth. These differences included completely different tooth counts and an additional sinus cavity in the snout of the slender specimens that the T-Rex completely lacked. Furthermore, slicing into the leg bones of the famous dueling dinosaur specimen, which is another slender tyrannosaur, revealed an animal that was over 20 years old and had completely finished growing at only 1/10 the body mass of a mature T-Rex. The tiny tyrant was real. The researchers definitively concluded that Nanotyrannus was an entirely distinct genus, and they even identified a second species, officially naming the Jane specimen Nanotyrannus lithaeus. This monumental 2025 revelation completely upended the late Cretaceous ecosystem model. T-Rex was not the only tyrannosaur in North America at the end of the age of dinosaurs. If T-Rex was the lion of the Hell Creek Formation, weighing 18,000 pounds and built for raw, unmatched power, then Nanotyrannus was the cheetah of the ecosystem, weighing roughly 1,500 pounds and built for blistering speed. While this discovery brilliantly solved the mystery of Nanotyrannus, it opened a new, glaring hole in our understanding of T-Rex ontogeny. If Jane and the Cleveland skull were not juvenile T-Rex, then what did a real T-Rex teenager actually look like? The answer is that true juvenile T-Rex fossils are exceedingly rare, and those that do exist suggest that while T-Rex did indeed undergo a massive growth spurt, it was likely much bulkier and heavier set in its youth than the hypergracile Nanotyrannus. This revelation beautifully proves that while ontogeny drives massive morphological changes in an animal's life, it cannot be used as a blanket excuse to dismiss distinct, smaller species in the fossil record. Now, let us look at what happens when a true tyrannosaurid reaches adulthood. Around the age of 18 to 20, the explosive growth phase of a T-Rex and other large tyrannosaurids like Tarbosaurus and Daspletosaurus finally came to an end. The lines of arrested growth in their bones become incredibly tightly packed together near the outer edge of the bone cortex, forming what histologists call the external fundamental system, or EFS. The presence of an EFS is the definitive, undeniable proof of somatic maturity. It means the dinosaur had reached its absolute maximum genetic size and had stopped growing. The physical transition into adulthood was staggering to behold. The skull widened significantly at the back and shortened at the snout. This shift perfectly oriented the massive eyes forward to provide unparalleled binocular vision and deadly depth perception. The jaw muscles, specifically the musculus pterygoideus and musculus adductor mandibulae, swelled to grotesque, massive proportions. To accommodate this immense muscle mass, the skull bones fused together and thickened heavily. The teeth also completely changed. The slender, slicing blades of their youth were rapidly replaced by thick, heavily serrated, D-shaped spikes that are often compared to lethal bananas. These teeth were no longer just for slicing meat. They were encrassate, meaning thickened, and perfectly engineered to withstand immense stress and pressure. The adult Tyrannosaurid had become an osteophagous, or bone-eating, predator. Coprolites, which are fossilized feces attributed to adult T-Rex, are frequently found packed with pulverized, semi-digested fragments of Triceratops and hadrosaur bone. This proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that adults simply crushed straight through the armor and skeletons of their prey, consuming nutritious marrow and solid bone alike with an unbelievable bite force exceeding 12,000 pounds. However, the acquisition of this immense ecosystem-ruling power came at a very steep physical cost. The fossilized skeletons of adult tyrannosaurids read like prehistoric medical charts, detailing lives of unimaginable violence, trauma, and chronic pain. Because they were too massive to run down swift prey, adult tyrannosaurids had to engage in brutal close-quarters combat with the most dangerous and heavily armed herbivores to ever walk the earth. A triceratops equipped with 3-foot solid bone facial horns, or an ankylosaurus wielding a bone-shattering tail club, did not go down easily. The study of fossil diseases and injuries, known as paleopathology, shows that adult tyrannosaurids were battered, scarred survivors. The famous T-Rex specimen known as Stan features a completely healed broken neck, where 2 of his cervical vertebrae fused together after a catastrophic, life-threatening impact. Another Tyrannosaur specimen features a massive horn wound from a Triceratops driven straight through its ribs. Intra-specific combat, meaning fighting among their own kind, was also wildly rampant in Tyrannosaur populations. Many adult Tyrannosaur skulls, including the Jane Nanotyrannus specimen and numerous Daspletosaurus skulls, bear the unmistakable, healed puncture marks of other Tyrannosaur teeth. They viciously bit each other right on the face, likely contesting valuable territory, fighting for mating rights, or asserting dominance over a fresh carcass. Disease was equally ruthless and unforgiving. The largest and most complete T-Rex ever discovered, named Sue, displays truly horrifying paleopathologies. Sue's massive jaw is riddled with smooth-edged holes. These were long thought to be bite marks from another T-Rex, but they are now widely attributed to a severe parasitic infection similar to modern Trichomonas gallinae. This is a protozoan parasite that infects the throats of modern birds. This horrific infection would have caused massive swelling, ulcers, and lesions in the throat and jaw, making eating an agonizing and potentially fatal ordeal. Furthermore, Sue suffered from advanced painful gout, which left her vertebrae fused and her massive tail immobilized in several places. While Tyrannosaurus rex serves as the ultimate standard-bearer for Tyrannosaurid ontogeny, the family tree was incredibly diverse, and growth strategies varied significantly across different continents and lineages. In late Cretaceous Asia, Tarbosaurus bataar ruled the Nemegged formation. Tarbosaurus was nearly identical in sheer size to T-Rex, and underwent a very similar explosive teenage growth spurt. However, close examination of structural differences in the skull of juvenile versus adult Tarbosaurus shows that they handled the extreme stresses of biting differently. While T-Rex developed a rigid, heavily fused skull to deliver raw, crushing bites, Tarbosaurus maintained a slightly more flexible skull, utilizing complex locking mechanisms in its jaw bones to safely distribute the stress of violently struggling prey. Meanwhile, the Albertosaurines of North America, which include Albertosaurus and Gorgosaurus, represent a slightly different evolutionary strategy. These tyrannosaurids were older, living millions of years before T-Rex ever evolved, and they were generally much more gracile in their build. Histological studies show that Albertosaurus grew at a slightly slower rate than T-Rex and actively maintained its longer, more cursorial proportions even well into adulthood. They were the marathon runners of the tyrannosaur world, strongly prioritizing speed and agility over the sheer brute force utilized by the later tyrannosaurines. Even stranger were the Aleoromini, a fascinating tribe of long-snouted tyrannosaurids found in Asia, which includes Aleoramus and the truly magnificent Quaens ramudus, affectionately dubbed Pinocchio Rex by paleontologists. For a time, scientists wondered if the long, delicate snouts of Aleoramus specimens were simply a juvenile trait, much like the slender snouts of teenage T-Rex. However, the groundbreaking discovery of a massive, highly mature Chiandosaurus specimen proved that this specific lineage maintained its long, gracile snout well into late adulthood. Their unique ontogeny involved fusing cranial bones and developing elaborate cranial ornamentation, but they never bulked up their jaws to crush heavy bone. This strongly indicates that they specialized in hunting smaller, swifter prey for their entire lives, occupying a totally different niche than their bone-crushing cousins. By combining histology, ontogeny, and massive population data from rare mass death sites, paleontologists have drafted a complete demographic survivorship curve for tyrannosaurids. The most famous and informative of these population datasets comes from the dry island Albertosaurus bone bed in Alberta, Canada. At this site, over 24 Albertosaurus individuals of varying ages died and were rapidly buried together in a single catastrophic event, most likely a massive flash flood. This extraordinary bone bed reveals a deeply fascinating demographic breakdown. It contains a few massive, old adults, a large number of older teenagers, but almost zero young juveniles. When plotted on a graph, the Tyrannosaurid survivorship curve beautifully resembles a modified Type 1 curve, very similar to modern large mammals or birds. Phase 1 is high infant mortality. Most tyrannosaurids died long before their first birthday, easily picked off by predators or succumbing to disease, the elements, and starvation. Phase 2 is the invincible teens. If a tyrannosaurid managed to survive its first 2 terrifying years, its chances of survival absolutely skyrocketed. Between the ages of 2 and 13, mortality rates dropped to roughly 2 to 4% per year. These growing juveniles were simply too fast to be caught by the larger predators and too large and dangerous to be bothered by the smaller ones. Phase 3 is the adult crash. The very moment tyrannosaurids reached sexual maturity and hit their absolute peak growth phase around age 14 or 15, mortality rates spiked violently, back up to a staggering 23% per year. Why did the largest, most powerful adults die at such incredibly alarming rates? The answer lies in the deeply harsh realities of their ecological niche. Adulthood brought on the brutal responsibilities of defending massive, resource-rich territories, battling dangerous rivals for mating rights, and undertaking the incredibly perilous task of hunting multi-ton, heavily armed prey. A single tiny misstep while pursuing a defensive triceratops could easily result in a shattered femur, ultimately leading to an agonizing death by starvation. Because of this unimaginably violent lifestyle, very few tyrannosaurids survived into true old age. The overriding biological paradigm for tyrannosaurids is strictly to live fast and die young. For a very long time, the famous specimen Sue was widely considered the oldest known T-Rex in the world, with her bone histology revealing an age of roughly 28 years. In more recent years, a massive, bulky specimen from Saskatchewan named Scotty and a beautifully preserved specimen currently in the Netherlands named Trix have rivaled Sue for the title of the absolute oldest tyrant. Precise histological analyses of these massive brutes indicate they reached approximately 30 years of age. But why only 30 years? Modern reptiles of comparable sizes, such as large crocodilians or giant tortoises, can easily live for 70 to over 150 years. The astonishing fact that a 9-ton apex predator completely burned out and died of old age by its 30th birthday is a massive testament to the unique tyrannosaurid metabolism. Tyrannosaurids were not the sluggish, cold-blooded, swamp-dwelling reptiles imagined by early scientists. Advanced isotopic analysis of their fossilized teeth and bones, perfectly combined with their explosive mammal-like growth rates, clearly indicates they possessed very high avian-like metabolisms. They were warm-blooded, highly active, and grew at rapid rates completely comparable to modern mammals and birds. This high-octane biological engine allowed them to achieve their massive, terrifying size in just 2 short decades. But it also fundamentally meant their biological clocks ticked much faster than those of modern reptiles. A 30-year-old T-Rex was a deeply geriatric animal. It was at the absolute, uncompromising end of its biological lifespan, its giant body heavily worn down by a violent lifetime of hypercarnivorous exertion. The ongoing study of Tyrannosaurid ontogeny has completely and permanently shattered the archaic view of dinosaurs as static, lumbering, unthinking monsters. Through the precise, microscopic science of paleohistology and the absolute willingness of the scientific community to engage in rigorous, continuously evolving debate, as perfectly seen in the dramatic 2025 resolution of the Nanotyrannus controversy, we now accurately view these animals as dynamic, breathing, changing organisms. We can track their extraordinary lives from the exact moment they hatched as fluffy, long-legged sprinters, to their terrifying, world-altering adolescent growth spurts, where they completely terrorized the mesopredator niche, all the way to their final, violent decades as the scarred, bone-crushing monarchs of the Late Cretaceous period. The bones of the tyrannosaurids are not just dead pillars of calcium phosphate, they are incredible, time-traveling biological clocks. And by learning exactly how to read them, we have miraculously resurrected the true, breathtaking life story of the most magnificent predators the world has ever known. Thank you for listening to G Fun Facts Online.